Fab. Okay. So on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, it will be 9 years since Kat Doggett allowed me to put a ring on her finger and become my wife. So we'll be celebrating our 9th anniversary this coming Wednesday, which is very cool. Oh, thanks. Wasn't expecting a little round of applause, but I assume that's for you, putting up with me for 9 years. As we think about feasting, celebrating, that for me was and continues to be my favourite day of feasting and celebrating I have experienced in my life. Now, confession time, you may or may not be aware that actually I'm not a prolific dancer. You may or may not have encountered this. There are those, I'm looking at Holly, who are just in their element and just seem to know what to do when music is playing. There are others like myself that don't quite seem to as intuitively know what to do when music starts to play in terms of with my physical being. But on that day, on my wedding day, I did perform the required first dance and I was excellent. So it was sort of like a kind of, and I feel like I did it really well. I feel like I sort of peaked at that level of dancing. I may or may not have danced any more after that. I don't really remember, it was a bit of a blur. But there was at least that dance. However, there was a wedding shortly after that, I think about a year or so after that, where I danced a lot more. And I think a big part of the reason for that was I was able to harness and unleash my inner peacock. So we've got a picture to show. So this is a year later. Here is the groom in the middle. So this is Luke and Emma's wedding. And so these waistcoats are inside out. So they're standard waistcoats, but as part of the design of them, they've got this kind of peacock print in them. And so I don't think it was something that had been prearranged. It just happened during the evening celebrations. We all turned the waistcoats inside out and we let loose. And I don't know, like you've probably seen peacocks. I'm sure everyone's seen peacocks, but maybe you've seen them at Leeds Castle or somewhere like that. And I think peacocks have just got that about them, haven't they? They just strut around. They're like, yes, that's right. You can look at me. Everyone else is. Look at me. I'm a peacock. And I don't know whether that's what was being sort of channeled in this moment and throughout the dancing of that evening, but it was one of the only times in my life I felt totally free and uninhibited in my dancing. So we had a good time. We celebrated hard that evening, and I certainly enjoyed some good dancing. So that's a couple of different weddings where they were celebrating and feasting. Marriage itself is a really good example of what is called cultural universals. You may have come across this term, or you may not. Cultural universals, it's kind of what it sounds like, really. It's effectively a cultural norm that is universal. So throughout the course of history, throughout global geography, these are things that just pop up in different cultures, independent of each other. So you might travel to another land that's had no influence from other places, and you will find certain things that happen throughout history, throughout different countries, the cultural universals. So let me give you an example. Language. It's hard to find a culture that doesn't have, in some way of communicating with each other, language. Art. Every culture in some way expresses itself artistically. Music. Every culture got some form of music. Cooking, humor, sport. All cultures throughout time, throughout the world, have what are called these cultural universals. Interestingly, when I was looking at these cultural universals, this idea of celebration came up. It cropped up. This idea of stopping to celebrate different things. So marriage would be one. But celebration in general, this idea of feasting and finding things to celebrate, all cultures throughout time, throughout the world, this is something that everyone does. It's not something that one culture thought, hey, this is great, let's go and colonize the world and we'll teach them all about celebrating. This is something that everyone just seems to intuitively know at certain points. We just got to down tools and celebrate because of whatever the reason might be. And I believe wholeheartedly, it's because there is something hardwired into human beings by God, where there is this desire to celebrate and to reflect and to give thanks for things that's going on. So this morning I'm encouraging you, and we, throughout this weekend, this idea of let's feast, let's celebrate. But I guess the question is, 1,000 years ago, tribal Amazonians were celebrating. 500 years ago, Renaissance Venetians were celebrating. Last night, Kentish men / men of Kent, let's not get into that one, were celebrating. I'm sure there are people, like I say, have celebrated throughout history and will continue to celebrate. So what's the big deal with me standing up here saying, well, let's feast, let's celebrate? In one sense, it's kind of like, well, yeah, like people do that. That's a thing. So I believe that feasting and celebration are hardwired into people, but I also believe that God himself has shown us the express purpose in our celebrating as his people. So we're going to go back in time and we're going to explore that idea this morning. So let's go back to the Torah. If you are familiar with that word, that's the first 5 books of the Bible are known as the Torah. And I think all the verses that we're going to refer to today are from those 5 books. We're going to paint a bit of a picture and try and draw out together why this God-authored concept of celebrating and feasting is so powerful and so important. So let's go back way to our friend Abraham. So it's Genesis chapter 12, the first 3 verses. You may be familiar with this. This is the Abrahamic covenant, where God makes a covenant with Abraham, and it says this: "The Lord has said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you." That's massive. Let's just take a moment to appreciate what that says. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Fast forward 10 chapters, got this idea being affirmed again. Genesis 22, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham. So this is the conclusion of the Abraham and Isaac sacrifice Mount Moriah scene. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." Okay. What do you think is the opposite of celebration and feasting? I had a bit of a think about this, and I think you can make a strong case that the opposite of celebration and feasting is slavery. That's what I'd propose to you this morning, that the opposite of this whole thing that we are talking about this weekend is slavery. So long story short, we move on from here, God speaking to Abraham and giving these literally world-changing promises, and we move into the descendants of Abraham, the heirs of this covenant and this promise, ending up as slaves, which in one sense is thoroughly unsurprising, in that if you think that there's going to be something that's going to rob this people of fulfilling the destiny that God has for them, slavery is surely the most effective way of that. I want to pause on this thought for a second, because I think we're familiar with, Prince of Egypt, and, the people are slaves and they're building pyramids, and, Moses comes and there's plagues in Red Sea and the rest of it. But I think we need to just stop and recognize, so these people, they are slaves for 400 years. 400 years. Think about how long that is. think about what that does to the identity of a people group, especially in comparison to this. So 400 years where all you know is slavery, all your ancestors have known, your race, your people, slavery. I was thinking a bit, in recent years, there's been a lot with things like Black Lives Matter. There's been a lot of spotlight on what we call systemic racism. Whatever your different political views are, I think we can all agree that racism is evil and wicked. And it's obviously really getting a lot of press at the moment, and rightly so. And it's really interesting thinking of the comparisons where you've got recognition that there are deep-rooted consequences of slavery which continue to manifest generations later. But we're at a point now where I think throughout large chunks of the world, we're saying that's an awful thing and mustn't ever happen. Like, slavery is not okay under any circumstances, and most people seem to be in agreement that that just shouldn't happen. But when you compare that to this circumstance that we're looking at with the Hebrews, 400 years, I'm sure they weren't into it, but culturally, the Egyptians were obviously down with it. They obviously thought this is pretty handy. Our pyramids are going up a lot faster thanks to these guys. And when you look at the culture of that day in that area with the other nations, no one really had big question marks about slavery. Everyone was into it. Everyone was doing it. You're either enslaving or you end up as the slave. It's just the way things roll. So, God had other plans. Let's move into the next book of the Bible, in Exodus. We read in the second chapter of Exodus that during that long period, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. So this is where we've got the story of God delivering the people, coming through the Red Sea, and then they arrive at Mount Sinai, and they have been delivered out of slavery in Egypt. Exodus 13, we read this. Moses said to the people, "Commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand." Eat nothing containing yeast. That's sort of the end of the verse, moves on to other things. Not quite the same focus. I'm not really talking about yeast this morning, but you get the idea. So we're in this scenario where you've got a group of people that God has made covenant promises with, and then you've got a period of 400 years of slavery, and now they've been freed. And now here they are in the wilderness. God has rescued them. But as you can imagine, slavery is ingrained in their being. How could it not be? It's in their bodies, it's in their minds, it's in their practices, it's in their culture, it's in their thinking, their habits, their patterns. It's slavery. Because you can imagine, can't you? So, hey, what do you do? Oh, I'm a slave. Oh, and your dad, what did he do? Oh, also actually a slave, now you come to mention it. Oh, what about his dad? Actually, he was a slave too. Can you believe that? 400 years, they're slaves. All of them. It's all they know. Slavery is ingrained in their being. They've been brought out of the land of their bondage, but that's just the beginning. This is only the start of what God is going to do. Physically, he's brought them out of slavery, but they are so far from those first couple of verses we read from Genesis. They are so far from being this people that God has called to be a blessing to literally all the nations of the earth, all the people of the earth. We've got a significant gap between where they're at and what God is wanting to do through them. So what does God do? There's something quite major that needs to happen here. So he's got this people, and to form them according to the purposes that he has for them, he's going to give them more than 600 laws. And I think sometimes we can get a bit hung up on this idea, and they can just seem a little bit weird, a little bit out there. But if you think about the nation we live in, I've actually no idea, but I suspect we've got more than 600 laws. I guess. Anyone? Yeah, I'm guessing we've got more than 600 laws in play. You need laws, don't you? When you've got a people living together as a nation, you need to practically be set up with this is okay, this is not okay, this is what you do in this scenario, this is what you don't do in this scenario. So they need a way of operating. These laws are really practical. So in that way, they're helpful, they're necessary. But they're really interesting because some of them you can clearly see beyond simply this is a clear, helpful law for a nomadic people living in the desert, but this is something that reveals to us what God is all about, that he is communicating something of his heart through the laws that he's putting in place. He is showing an understanding of who he is and how people live under his lordship. So there is some pretty tough read. You've ever done Bible in a year and started at Genesis. You may have got through the 50 chapters of Genesis and enjoyed a lot of narrative in there. There's some weird stuff in Genesis, but there's a lot of quite familiar, easy narrative. You can start to get a little bit bogged down in Exodus, but if you get through there, it's quite easy to hit a bit of a wall in Leviticus, isn't it? You think, goodness me, what have I just got myself into? And if you get through Leviticus and then you get into Numbers, you think, come on, when are we going back uphill? This is pretty heavy stuff, trying to just work out what's going on. And so much of it, having that cultural understanding is so key to try and get to the bottom of what is this stuff really trying to say. But in the midst of what can be some challenging chapters to try and figure out what's going on here, there's an absolutely fascinating one in Leviticus 23. So in Leviticus 23, we get an entire chapter purely about feasts and festivals. So let's read the first couple of verses. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed festivals, the appointed festivals of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies." And then it goes on to lay out these things that God is appointing as festivals and feasts for his people. Now, in general, when you read through Leviticus 23, you can see clear parallels to something like this in general, a weekend away with the church. You can see there's really obvious parallels in that. But obviously this year, we're looking into that much more explicitly and drawing things out in terms of well, you'll see. We'll come to that. But just in general, things like eating together, drinking together, resting with friends and family, stopping our work, celebrating God's goodness. These are all general things that are reflected through Leviticus 23 that make so much sense for us, but there's much more to it than that as well. So I think if you were to put yourself in this position, bunch of people, slavery is ingrained, but there's bigger plans. There are things that you're wanting to achieve in and through them. And you were in charge of these 600 and something laws. I think you could probably be forgiven for just skipping Leviticus 23 in terms of putting that in place. Because feasts and festivals, like, is it that important? I don't think we've got that in our country, do we? I can't think of anything that's any sort of law or command to feast or celebrate. The whole thou shalt not murder, pretty important. I think if any of us felt like that was one that we could just leave out, I think I might sort of have a few question marks there about your outlook on life if you felt like it was, that's an optional. But feasts and festivals, there's a lot of things. Yes, definitely that should be there. That's an important law for these people. Why is this so important? Why is it not even optional? Why isn't it a case of if you're an extrovert and you love to party, then God's going to set aside some time that you can just absolutely live it up. And if it's not really your scene, don't worry, crack on with life. It's not optional. Everyone is to do these festivals every single year. It's built in to the rhythm of life, the annual calendar of these people. It's built into their identity of who they are. Why? Why is it such a big deal? I want to give you a couple of reasons that we can think about. So one is that this is powerful for inner formation, especially in the context of people that are being redeemed from slavery. It is powerful for inner formation. It forms a people into a people of gratitude when this is the rhythm of their life. They are no longer slaves. Slaves don't get to stop and feast and celebrate. These people do, and they're commanded to, and it forms who they are. They are free to stop working, to enjoy one another, and to joy God. They are to learn, they're commanded to learn, to set aside time, to set aside resources, purely to celebrate, to enjoy God's goodness. And that forms you as a person. That forms the kind of person that you individually are becoming. And as a nation, it starts to reform who they are. Secondly, it's a powerful witness to the surrounding nations of the nature of God. So you think about this for a second in their context. All the other nations, they've got their gods who've got their various different things that you have to do. Some are fairly standard, like, harvest-related things. Some are pretty grim, like child sacrifice. There's some pretty hairy stuff going on in terms of who these other gods are and what these other gods are demanding. So people want to know, hey, Israel, what's your God like? Well, our God is a God of celebration and a God of joy, and he is not a hard taskmaster, and he is not boring. Let me read to you what I think is the best example of just how wild this is in terms of what God is showing about himself in something he commanded. So let's look at Deuteronomy, the last book in the Torah, book number 5. From chapter 14, it says this: "Be sure to set aside 1/10 of all that your fields produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine, olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God at the place that he will choose as the dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. But if this place is too distant and you have been blessed by the Lord and you cannot carry your tithe because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is so far away, then exchange your tithe for silver. Take the silver with you, go to the place where the Lord your God will choose, and use the silver to buy whatever you like. Cattle, sheep, wine, other fermented drink, get the beers in, anything you wish. Then you and your household will eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice." Like, these are the kind of ones that when you're doing Bible in a year, you just, okay, keep going. Let me get through my daily allowance today. And we can just read through this. Yeah, okay. We need to stop and think about this. Do you see what he's saying? 1/10 of your produce, eat it and have a good time. And if it's too much, because God's blessed you too much, sell it. Take the money to the place where God's going to show you, which we know later on becomes Jerusalem. Take that money, and then it's up to you. It's your choice. What do you fancy? Cattle, sheep, wine, other fermented drinks? Go buy whatever you want. This is 1/10 of what of your income, your produce from the year. Go to Jerusalem and spend 1/10 of your income on having a great time with your family. This is mental. This is the kind of thing that we've got to pause and say, what does that tell us about who God is? Because boring gods don't allow that. Taskmaster gods don't allow that. Gods that love their people and want to form their people into a people of gratitude and joy and thanksgiving and celebration, that then makes a lot of sense. Do you see? We need to start to look at verses like that and think, okay, like there are some mindsets about God that we have to allow to fall into line with what he himself is revealing, not just what we might have experienced previously. So God's post-slavery people must live a life that defiantly rejects the patterns of slavery. The third point, before we start to wrap this up, is that this is powerful because it is a clear reminder that what they feast on is the goodness of God. There is a depth. When you look through Leviticus 23, there is a depth to each and every one of the feasts and festivals that God sets in place, because each of them is celebrating something of God and what he has done or is going to do. So they celebrate that this is a God who has brought us out of slavery into salvation, that this is a God who has produced a harvest for us to live and be sustained. Each and every one of these points to the goodness of God, and each feast is centered on the fact that this God, he is good. Look at what he's done. Look at what he is doing. Look at what he is going to do. We'll finish up with that thought. So I think after this, all this talk of Jewish laws and looking at their laws, their customs, it's easy to go one of two ways with these kind of things. Now, it's interesting to see that in the New Testament, a lot of what's having to be addressed when you look through some of the different controversies and the debates that are happening, a lot of what's having to be addressed is people that are still steeped in a Jewish perspective on life and are basically going, yeah, we're into this whole Jesus thing like that, but surely circumcision is still important. And surely this is still important, that's still important. And there's a lot of backwards and forwards. Okay, so a lot of these new converts, they have been raised Jewish. You know, Jesus is the Jewish, is a Jewish man. He is the Messiah for these people. What stays? What goes? And there's a lot of that in the New Testament, these kind of conversations. So in one sense, it would be easy to take things like this and potentially take it too seriously, and we just try and like read into it and get all the details and like try and form ourselves into this kind of like semi-Hebraic thing. I think for us, I would suggest that the risk for us would be the total opposite. You know, for most of us, we'll get a little taste later on of a little Jewish custom. There's a little teaser for you there. But for most of us in this room, we're probably fairly unfamiliar with Jewish life. And so for most of us, the temptation would be the total opposite, and actually to write this stuff off as totally irrelevant. To say these are the parts of the Bible that are just confusing and difficult. We don't really get it. We live a long time later in a very different culture, in a very different country. We got Jesus. This kind of stuff. Let's just move on from that, shall we? But we are not trying to say we're just going to copy as closely as we possibly can, but we certainly ignore these things at our peril for reasons that hopefully are already, becoming clear. And let's look at a final thought on that. We ignore these things at our peril because they clearly communicate to us the heart of the God that we serve. You might say, well, we're not slaves in Egypt, and we never have been. We are not living in an agrarian culture where we are celebrating that the grain has grown in our fields. So why the comparisons? But we are seeing the heart of God through these things. And as well as the heart of God, we see that in each of these things, I was going to say when you look carefully, but to be honest, a lot of you don't even have to look that carefully. It's fairly blatantly obvious that we see a fulfillment in our Lord Jesus Christ. Some of these things take a bit of digging and a bit of understanding. Some of these things are super obvious and in your face. Hang on a minute, that is clearly pointing to Jesus. That is clearly something that in its fullness and in its fulfillment will happen in Jesus. Jesus is clearly the ultimate Passover. Jesus is clearly the ultimate atonement. And on it goes. So let's finish with this. Feasting and celebrating are wonderful. They are profoundly biblical. So they're not just wonderful because everyone throughout history and throughout the world thinks they're great because God has designed us in such a way, but they are wonderful because biblically God has made it clear what this is all about and why this is so important. Because God has, in initiating this expression of celebration of feasting, has given it such substance in the depth, such depth in the substance that he has given for these. He didn't initiate feasts and celebrations for the sake of it, just because it sounded like a good idea. Otherwise, what would happen is we would feast, we would celebrate, we'd have a good time, we'd go home, and we'd feel empty. Because the feast and the celebration is over, and the good time was the feast and the celebration. The good time's not the feast and the celebration. The good time is our Father in heaven and our Lord Jesus Christ. and everything that we find in and through him. So we go home and our lives continue to be an expression of the goodness and the feasting and the celebrating, because that's who he is and that's who our Father is. We celebrate something incredible that God has done, is doing, will do, and it forms us into the people that he wants us to be, a people who can be a blessing to all nations because of the gratitude and the joy that comes out of us. Anyone can, and everyone does, celebrate and feast, but no one should be able to like the people of God, because there is a depth and a substance in our feasting and our celebrating that trumps a million miles beyond any other cause for feasting and celebrating. So over the rest of this weekend, I want to really encourage you to embrace that, live that truth out, celebrate, feast, enjoy the goodness of God. And at this point, let me drop a little teaser trailer to have you thinking through the rest of today towards this evening. Simeon, at the moment, loves a good cliffhanger. So in some of his kids' programs, when it's a really good episode, they can't fit it in the time. So it will finish on a cliffhanger. And so I introduced him to this term, cliffhanger. And now he just thinks it's like the best thing. He thinks he's so grown up. Daddy, that episode is a cliffhanger. And so let me give you a little cliffhanger as we finish up. I want to say that as I've been sharing this morning, or even in the build-up to this weekend, you might be aware that within yourself, within your mind, within your heart, that there are barriers. You might think of this idea of celebrating God's goodness, and you might think, love it, but there's this or that I just feel holds me back. I just feel like I cannot, in total freedom and liberty, express the joys of that because of X. You might be aware. It might be there's something in your mind right now. Or it might be that there isn't, but maybe it's something you just want to ponder throughout the rest of today and ask God, hey, speak something to me, share something with me. Tonight we're going to hear from Nikki. He's got a few things sort of along those lines to sort of just provoke us a little bit in that. And then we're going to ask God to move. And we are going to trust that this evening is a time where he'll break things, where there's going to be a freedom that comes to that expression of celebrating his goodness. That, like I say, we don't go home and say, oh, not a weekend away anymore, so I can't experience God in the same way. It's different now. It doesn't have to be different now, because God can break things and bring us into a new freedom. So yeah, I just want to really encourage you. If God is stirring that in your heart, then allow the expectancy and the anticipation to grow, that tonight we trust that the Father moves really powerfully amongst us. So let me just pray as we finish up. Yeah, Heavenly Father, we thank you for who you are, that you are a God who commands his people, stop your working, celebrate, feast, enjoy my goodness, enjoy the things that I've done in your life. And here we are, and we're going to do exactly that. And we're going to celebrate you, and we recognize who you are. We give you all the praise and all the glory, and we say that the substance of our feasting is because of you. It's all because of you. Father, would you just bless our time together throughout the rest of today? And Father, we already pray in expectation and anticipation tonight. Move by your Spirit, break off chains, bring freedom, that we can enjoy you and the depths of celebrating in your goodness in a whole new way. Amen. Amen.